All right, so we're going to go back to our end user here, Bill. We want to make sure, like I said, that all of those components are checked for this end user. Home cluster, enable user for unified CM, IM, and presence, and then select the UC services profile that we have specified. And this probably could be even named differently because the UC service profile is really everything, isn't it? It's not just IM and presence, but we could create just a separate UC profile just for IM and presence. Not really necessary. In fact, we could probably just utilize one profile for the entire configuration. All right, now a couple other things that we need to ensure. Again, always have this checkbox, allow control from device for CTI. And then we have to ensure that the primary extension is established for the user so that when they log into Jabber, that's the extension that gets assigned to their Jabber client. Unlike a phone, there always has to be a primary extension in our Jabber client. And then we need to make sure that we have several different services or what we call permissions groups assigned to the user. This is probably the one place where people make the biggest mistake by not including the appropriate groups. We need a standard CCM end user, and then we need all of the groups related to CTI. So we'll do a search and contain CTI. There are two CTI components that we have not configured. Secure connection, we're not running security in this particular case. If we were, we would have that as part of the group. And standard real-time and trace collection. That's used for debugging. It shows up with CTI because of the description that it has in it. But the reason why the other CTI services don't or groups don't fall under this search is because we've selected all of our CTI groups. Allow CTI call monitoring, call park monitoring, call recording. Now you may not need all of these functions. You might be able to pick and choose depending on what the end user is trying to accomplish with their particular CTI integration. It doesn't hurt certainly to have a lot of these different features enabled for future, but at the same time, there are some very fundamental ones that need to be selected. For this particular instance, we've gone ahead and selected all of the end user CTI components for this particular end user. So now we've got essentially our user set up, we've got our Jabber client set up. There are a couple of other things that we need to do, but let's just review on the slides here. Make sure that we associate the devices. We're going to click Find. We're going to find all the devices associated to this end user, the Jabber client and the desk phone client. And then we're going to save those changes. We need to make sure that we set our primary extension. In this case, it was 1,000. So our next task is to configure the actual Jabber client. Now, on our Windows computer, we can launch the Jabber client. In this case, we're using a Windows computer. It's not that Jabber is not available for Mac or some other device, but in this case, we are using it as in a Windows client. We're going to go ahead and enter the sign-in credentials. We already know that this integration is completed with Unified Communications Manager because we verified all those settings. We'll go ahead and add our new location here, assign that, so I'm at work. And this is my Jabber screen. Now, once Jabber's registered, if I had a list of contacts, if I had voicemail, we don't have voicemail set up on this phone presently, but if I had voicemail configured, I would of course see voicemails and I'd be able to control my voicemail. We don't have voicemail account settings on this particular client. If I had my meetings, I would see a list of all my meetings. And this is being pulled from Active Directory in real time. Because remember, B. Smith is a user in Active Directory. Under contacts, I can add a contact. So I can do a quick search for J. Let's do, let me see what her end user, J. White. Okay. And let's create corporate contacts. Now, we have not established Jay White as a as a CCNA collab. There we go. We have not established Jay White as a Jabber user necessarily, but Jay White is a user in this let me put this back in this cluster. Let's see. Let me select that user. All right. Now, we don't see a presence status for Jay White because Jay White as an end user has not really been set up completely, hasn't been assigned to a device and whatnot. But if Jay White was assigned to an endpoint or assigned to device and had a presence state in the IM and presence server, we could see Jay White's status. If they're in a meeting, if they're online, we can open up a chat with Jay White. We can initiate a call with Jay White. And right now, chat is our only option because Jay White is not associated to an end device. We're not going to do that presently. We're just going to do some basic extension dialing from here. So that corporate directory gives us that ability to kind of actively search all of our IM and presence users and everybody that's integrated as part of the system. So if we log in, one of the things I want to point out here, in fact, let me go ahead and sign out real quick. One of the things I want to point out here are some of the settings that we have under advanced settings. If we go to advanced settings, we are communicating with Unified Communications Manager 9 or later in this case. Now, you could choose an account of IM and presence, but we want desk phone mode in this particular case. So we want the control to be done through Cisco Unified Communications Manager. That's going to give us the ability to have that CTI integration to control the phone. And there's back-end communication between Unified Communications Manager and IM and presence through a SIP trunk that allows them to communicate the control messages. So 10.1.5.15 is our CUCM server or publisher. And we could certainly, based on the login information, use the default server, which would allow us to connect essentially to multiple servers in a cluster. All right. In the server address box, we're going to enter the IP address of the communications manager, which we did, and then we're going to save that information. This will give us the ability to now log in to IM and presence, to Jabber, and then allows us to place calls. Now you'll notice here, in this particular case, we don't have an option for desk phone mode. Because of the way this is set up, we only use our computer for calling. In our particular case, because we're using Unified Communications Manager 9 or later, we have the ability to use our CUCM server as our control point, which is going to give us that ability to go and use our device. Let's go ahead and log in, and let me show you what I'm referring to. Down at the bottom left side of the screen here, we have the ability, as soon as the integration comes up here, we have the ability to utilize Jabber to either control our desk phone or to control our Jabber client. So we had a little bit of synchronization. Notice it says here, use my computer for calls, use my phone for calls. So if I use my phone for calls, when I actually enter an extension and dial, my phone will actually ring to that extension. I've got my video window here, but my phone is ringing to that extension. We'll go ahead and hang up that call. If I was to switch this to use my desk for calls, same thing, but the only difference is now all of the control functions and the speakers and the microphone and everything that's on this desktop would be used to control that call. All right. So we're going to use because we don't have any speakers attached to this system, we're going to go ahead and use our desk phone as our primary control point. We'll use Jabber as kind of our contact list and managing our voicemails, but we're going to use the phone itself for our physical communication device. We have a list of recents. We can see we've done several different test calls here, and we made different calls to, and if we had a list of over 100 different contacts, we can sort by date, we can sort by placed calls, received calls, missed calls, etc. Now, once the Jabber client has registered, it's not going to show, it didn't show us in this case, any kind of registration errors. But if I did have errors or if there was an issue with communication, I would go under the help, under Jabber here, and I would say show notification errors. Now, we did have some errors, unable to connect, unable to connect. This was from previous configuration attempts when we were setting this Jabber client up initially. And the timestamp, as you can see, is not the correct time. So these are some of the other notifications that we received. Now, it's very cryptic, right? It just says unable to connect. The error code is really what's important, because you would be able to search on that error code and identify potentially the reasons for not being able to connect. Maybe a service profile is not set up correctly. Maybe your authentication credentials are incorrect, whatever it might be. In this case, the CJ1093 is authentication failure. We had previously done some authentication attempts that were invalid, and we did that so that we could see some of those logs. Another way to verify registration is if you go under Help and Show Connection Status. Show Connection Status will show you the present server that you're connected to, the protocol that you're using for XMPP, for control and functions, the IP address of the present server. Because we didn't have voicemail set up in our service profile, we don't see any voicemail attached. We've also got our CTI control connected. Everything that we see here is based on what we saw in that IM and presence service profile that we had configured that had all of our service profile settings. The line is 1000, the controlled device, that's the MAC address of the controlled device, and this is the address of our publisher, our Unified Communications publisher. Notice Jabber is using SIP to communicate. So we can see a lot of that information. If we were troubleshooting, say, for example, voicemail, I would go in here and show connection status, and I can see that there is something not quite right about voicemail. We have the right IP address, but we're saying we're presently not connected to voicemail. So we would have to kind of go in and really identify why that connection were failing. Directory services looks good. Outlook integration is good. Presence integration is good, and so on. So lots of different quick things that you can see from that particular window. All right. And this is just a slide representation of the same thing that we just referred to. In this particular case, obviously, this is a completely different setup, not our setup, but same thing, same thing. One of the things I want to point out as well is that we do have a kind of a quick menu for Jabber as well. I don't necessarily have to be in the full Jabber client to place calls and manage my Jabber communications. I can get my contacts here, my voicemail. I can open up my Jabber desktop from here, or I can simply place calls. If I want to place a call, dial the number, hit enter, and that call will go through. Okay. This, there'll be a small window that will pop up as well, indicating that a call is coming in. And you can choose to decline or answer that call as it comes in. That's part of the notification process that Jabber provides. We'll probably see a little bit about that later on. If we want to verify all of the video and audio input components on Jabber, not always do these clients or these peripherals connect to Jabber automatically. So it's important that we go through our options to identify that connectivity. If I open up by clicking on this gray area, right, where it says work, I get my options screen. It's interesting because when you go under here, those options don't show up here, right? We can't really see any of the options under these screens. We can go through the options menu, but it's easier just to simply just click on your status or your location, and you can start to adjust the options. The reason why is because it's taking you to the location settings within the options, but it's just a quick way to kind of get to those options. So we have some general options: start Jabber when Windows starts. Remember my open conversations, meaning let's keep a history of the conversations. But more importantly, the audio and video component. For audio, we have, of course, our microphone that's built into our webcam. That's acting as our microphone. We can see the levels as I'm communicating here. For my speaker output, I can select a different speaker output. We'll go ahead and utilize that output. We're not going to hear anything here because while we have an audio card in this device, we don't necessarily have any speakers attached. All right, some of the advanced settings, we can identify primary and secondary devices. This is one of the things that we had communicated about during the lecture, was having the ability to identify what my primary devices were going to be. So when the Jabber client opens and is trying to initiate communication to a device, it's always going to kind of reference this list from an audio perspective. Similar things with video. We have our Logitech webcam C930E that's attached. And if we had other video cameras, we could switch between those peripherals to identify usability. Under advanced, if I had additional video cameras installed, I could specify my primary, secondary, and so on. So as long as those components show up in this screen, you won't have any problems utilizing that feature or those peripherals as part of your Jabber integration. All right, so in the Jabber client, file options, audio, if you click advanced, which we saw, we can prioritize our individual interfaces or individual peripherals. So now all we need to do is go ahead and go through the process of testing video calls on our endpoint. All right, so I've got desk phone mode presently running. I'm going to go ahead and go into my Jabber client, and I'm going to place a call to 1001. All right, I'm going to have to answer this call. So I've answered that call on the other side. Let's go ahead and close that out. I've answered that call on the other side. Now, it's interesting in this particular case, I'm not seeing video in my Jabber client, but on my phone, you can see the video. You can see the video from the remote side. We've got a little sign there saying enjoy the show. And we've got our self view, all right? And presently our camera that is being utilized is the camera that's on this phone. We have that camera muted right now. You can kind of see there is some visibility there, but we pretty much have that camera muted right now. There's really nothing on the end of that camera. If I wanted to, I could use video on my desktop. I don't necessarily have to use the video on my phone. But I would have to switch my settings to utilize the video that's on my Jabber client. Once we see the video stream coming from the phone, we can actually go into the phone itself and look at some of the call statistics. Now, the nice thing about looking at these call statistics is it gives us the ability to see what kind of codec we're sending and receiving, our sample sizes, in this case 20 milliseconds, the number of packets that are being sent and received, the average jitter, the max jitter, lost data packets, and so on. So we're going to go to applications and administrative settings, and then we're going to take a look at status, and last thing we'll look at is call statistics. So we can see in this particular case we're using G722. Our receive size is 20 milliseconds. Number of packets sent and received. Our average jitter is 1. Our max jitter is 10. So very important. And we can scroll through this so we can see things like the mean opinion score of the call. In this case, it's 4.5, which is essentially toll quality. 4.5 is toll quality. Remember, we're running an uncompressed codec here, so our mean opinion score should be pretty high. We see packet concealment ratios that we have. A lot of different things, but the primary thing that we're looking at here is what is the codec that we're using, particularly for troubleshooting bandwidth issues, right? 722 is an uncompressed codec. So that's going to require the most amount of bandwidth. And we're looking for things like jitter and packet loss. Packet loss is a very important concept in this with these calls. We'd want less than a 1% packet loss. So if we go back into the call statistics, what we were looking at there were the call statistics for audio. Now, if I go back in here and I go into status and call statistics, you'll notice at the bottom of the screen, at the top of the screen, we see call statistics for audio, but at the bottom of the screen, I can also push call statistics for video. And I can see similar things. We're running H.264, average jitter, max jitter, received packet loss, number of frames sent, number of frames received, the latency, and all the characteristics that are important for operations of this phone with a real-time media. Very important concept. So oftentimes if you're running into an issue, whether it's a quality issue or some sort of connectivity issue, one of the things that we will do, let's turn off the video. Actually, let's do this and turn off my camera. Okay. One of the things that we want to make sure of when we're troubleshooting and we're trying to identify these issues with these calls is we need to look at those statistics. We need to make sure that the codecs that we're using or the codecs that we established for that call based on the location of the devices. All of this stuff is going to be controlled from Unified Communications Manager, and all of this stuff is going to be something that you would have to set up as part of the overall design and implementation of locations and regions and call admission control settings within your cluster. So that concludes our initial exercise where we're setting up video to operate between our desk phone and our Jabber client and two 9971s. Later on, we'll take a look at some more exercises where we integrate some additional components into our architecture.